Hi class, so this is going to be an intro lecture for cellular respiration. Also going to do an intro lecture on photosynthesis next. And then those two things, we're going to have a few activities, the activities we've been doing. We're going to have a few of those, one on cell respiration, one on photosynthesis, and then one that combines the two and shows you how they're related. So, those activities will have more specifics and a little more detail than what I'm going to show you here. So this is just meant as an intro. So you go into those having some kind of idea about what we're doing with the processing. Right? So for cellular respiration, I want to remind you that the goal for this is to make ATP. Right? That's the whole idea for cellular respiration is what can we do inside the cell to make ATP. Right? I'm going to show you what's called a summary reaction. So this is a chemical reaction. And I'm not going to worry about, for those of you that have had chemistry, this is not going to be a balanced reaction. So I can tell you that up front, but I just want us to get some ideas about what we're using and what we're getting from cellular respiration. All right, so all these things on the left side of our arrow here that I have so far, C6, H12O6, O2, and H2O, all of those things are referred to as our reactants. Those are things we're putting into our chemical reactions. And then the products we're getting out are going to be CO2, H2O, and then ATP. And remember, that's our actual goal, right? That's our chemical energy we're trying to make. That's the goal of this process, is to make that ATP. All right, so let's label some of this stuff here. So C6H12O6, that is glucose. So in cellular respiration, to do it from start to finish, the way we're looking at it, we have to start with glucose. You can make ATP by breaking down fats and proteins and even DNA and RNA. But the way we're looking at it, we're just kind of assuming we start with glucose as our reactant. Right, so that's glucose. O2, of course, is just atmospheric oxygen. Right, regular oxygen that we're breathing in from the air. And then we've seen H2O. You all know H2O is water. So those are our reactants. That's what I want you thinking. To do cellular respiration, what do I have to have? Glucose, oxygen, and water. Okay? And then our products are going to be CO2, which is carbon dioxide, H2O, which is water. And yes, it's on both sides. We use water, we make water. And then, of course, ATP, which is our goal, right? That's our energy molecule that we're trying to make. Right, so those are our reactants and products. And then there's one thing that I want to show you, one other thing with this summary reaction. Then I'm going to tell you a little bit about how we do this. Okay, so the carbons that are in glucose. So these numbers represent how many of each of these atoms. So glucose has 6 carbons, 12 hydrogens, and 6 oxygens. So these 6 carbons from our glucose end up here in our carbon dioxide. Okay, in an intro class, I'm not worried about all the super big details of how we're doing this, but I think it's kind of important to understand that that carbon from that glucose is going to just be released as carbon dioxide, because we always hear life on Earth is carbon-based. And I think it makes it easy then to think, well, what do we need from glucose? Like, what are we taking from glucose to make energy? I think it's easy for people to just think, well, duh, it's carbon, right? I mean, carbon-based life, aren't we just using glucose as carbon? But if all 6 of those carbon atoms are lost as carbon dioxide, right? We breathe that stuff out. That carbon dioxide is just a waste product. So if we're not using it for the carbon, we have to be using it for something else, of course, right? So I just wanted to kind of point to you about what that carbon comes from. All right. So the most important thing with cellular respiration, again, we're not going to see very many, if any, specific step-to-step kinds of things. But if I had to tell you just one thing about what's the most important in all of this, electrons. Okay, that's really the most important thing. So that's kind of the answer to, well, if carbon isn't what we're trying to get out of the glucose, then what do we want? What are we trying to get to? That's the answer, electrons. We're trying to get to the electrons. So we can do things with electrons. Electrons have energy associated with them. So we can do things with those electrons that ultimately end up producing our ATP. All right, and then I want to tell you the steps. Steps in cellular respiration. So to go from a molecule of glucose to getting the products we have listed, we've got to do 4 things. Okay, we start with a process called glycolysis, and the lecture activities will get more into detail. Like, there's a section just on glycolysis, and it's still kind of a generic overview. It's got more detail than I'm telling you here, but it's still kind of a generic overview of, okay, glycolysis, what do we start with? What do we end with? What do we make? So that's kind of the approach that activity is going to take on cellular respiration. Right? So we start with glycolysis, right? And then we have what often is just called a transition step. Okay, so what it really is a step that's forming this molecule that's called acetyl-CoA. Okay, so that's kind of what our transition is. There's a few different names for it. I know one of the activities we're using is just going to call it a transition step, but that transition is required to head into step 3, which is called the citric acid cycle. So we take the end product of glycolysis, we turn it into acetyl-CoA in step 2, and then now we're ready for the citric acid cycle. And then the last step is called the electron transport chain. The electron transport chain. All right, and I want to show you something real quick. I'm going to come back up here. So this ATP that we're making, if we start with 1 glucose, this is going to be highly variable, and it depends on a lot of things. But the generic idea, if we start with 1 glucose, we can make around 32 or so ATPs from that. Okay, so in these 4 steps we have listed, we're making around 32 ATPs. And I want to show you, glycolysis is going to end up making 2 of those. The transition step doesn't make any. The citric acid cycle makes 2 of those. Right? So the electron transport chain makes about 28 of them. Okay? If this number changes some, like if you look on Google and you see, hey, this says 36, it's okay. It's just taking other things into account. Okay, so we'll go with 32, and that's the breakdown. So, I mean, what makes most ATP? Electron transport chain. All right, so activities we're going to be doing. We'll go into those steps in a little more detail.